Hey, good morning again, everyone, and welcome to our Middle East Peace Now May 11th webinar with Zachary Foster. And before we begin, I'm Janet Tullen, President of Middle East Peace Now. As always, we'd like to thank our sponsors for this event, Northfielders for Justice in Palestine, Israel, and Women Against Military Madness. We greatly appreciate these organizations and others in their support of MEPN monthly forums. Please do consider supporting them by attending their events as well. And before I begin, or introduce our speaker, Tom will share a few housekeeping items with a slide. Tom, if you could please show the slide. All participants will be muted for the duration of the event. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature of Zoom. Try to use the Q&A and not the chat for your questions, please. The chat is for other comments, but the questions for Zach will be in the Q&A, and we'll put them in the queue. Use the chat feature for any administrative help or questions, and we'll do our best to assist you. Please be respectful in the chat and the Q&A. We reserve the right to remove anyone who is causing harm. If Zoom is not working for you, please email MEPN@MEPN.org and we'll do our best to help you. This event will also be available on MEPN's YouTube channel in the coming week. And now to introduce our speaker, but before I do, I will say that once I have introduced Zach, I will be signing off, and our past president and board member, Kathy Adam, will be taking over, just so you know. Zachary Foster holds an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown University and a Ph.D. in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University. He's a fellow at the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. Zach runs a digital archive called Palestine Nexus and writes a newsletter called Palestine in Your Inbox. Zach is a frequent contributor to international media outlets, including the Israeli newspaper Haaretz and TRT, the national public broadcaster of Turkey. And I know that Zach is also available on X, formerly known as Twitter. Zach, welcome to Middle East Peace Now.
Thank you so much for having me, and hopefully everyone can see my screen. I am going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we will flip to a Q&A. So let's get started. This is a presentation about Israel's depopulation of Palestine. And I'd like to begin with a question that most Zionists had to ask themselves from the late 19th century, when Zionism first came onto the scene, all the way to 1948, which is, how is it that you establish a Jewish state in a land that is 70, 80, 90% non-Jewish, that is 70, 80, 90% Palestinian Arab? That is the starting point for so many Zionist leaders and thinkers. And I think many Zionists, certainly in the early period, embraced an approach of reconciliation. That is to say that the native inhabitants of Palestine would accept a Jewish homeland in Palestine because of all of the benefits that the Zionist movement would bring to Palestine, owing to Zionist investment and Zionist ingenuity. Right? Zionists are draining the swamps. They're making the desert bloom. And so for those reasons, there was this belief among many Zionists that the native inhabitants would accept political subjugation, owing to the economic benefits that Zionism brought. And then I think there was a little bit more of a sober view that was embraced by many Zionists at the time, which was basically a policy of bribery, which was that, if we can just give them enough money in terms of direct subventions, then they will accept political subjugation. And that's exactly what the Zionists pursued throughout the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. They bribed the editors of most of the major Palestinian newspapers. They bribed Palestinians to issue declarations of support. They thought they could buy land in places like Jordan or Iraq, as we will discuss on the subsequent slides, in order to relocate Palestinians there. But I think the most common view, certainly after 1936, the most common view was that no, the natives are not going to accept a foreign takeover of their land. And if that is the case, then the only option was to take Palestine by force, including forced expulsion. And that was the position that most Zionist leaders settled on by the mid to late 1930s and certainly by the 1940s. Um, and I think ideally, from the Zionist point of view, the Palestinians would accept voluntary flight, right? That is to say that they would be willing to leave on their own. That was, of course, ideal, right? It wasn't that I think Zionists dreamed of uprooting Palestinians from their homes. No, they had hoped that the Palestinian Arabs would leave on their own. But of course, they were aware that that was unlikely. And I think with that setup, let's talk about even prior to 1948. Um, let's talk about the displacement of many Palestinian Arabs from Palestine in the decades leading up to 48. So this displacement this begins already in the late 19th century. Between the years 1882 and 1929, the estimate is that something like 8,000 Palestinians were evicted from their homes, especially in the north, in the Galilee. You can see here, pictured to the right, this is a map of the Jewish settlement in Palestine from 1881 to 1914, and you'll see the Jewish settlers, they colonized primarily the coastal plains and then the Galilee, and those were the areas where those 8,000 Palestinians were displaced from. Now, it's important to remember that the Zionists, they bought the land, right? They owned the legal title, which gave them the right to evict the native inhabitants. So it's not that so I think we're going to get to a subsequent slide where a Zionist leader basically says, look, there's three ways you can expel Palestinians. You can buy the land, and then you own the land, you can kick them out. Or you can in a war, you can expel people. Or if you're a state, you can pass laws and regulations that force people out of their homes. So there are three strategies. And the first strategy, which was buying land, that was the strategy embraced from the 1880s all the way to 1947. And as you can see here, in 1878, in 1887, in 1892, in 1895, Zionists bought land in various parts of Palestine, and there were either pasture, disputes over pasture rights, or basically the Zionists just demanded the Palestinians vacate, and that obviously led to an outbreak of violence. Let's move to the next slide. So I would say the transfer proposals really, I would say, came into full force in the 1930s. And I think the reason is because in the 1920s, you actually did have a very important Zionist at the time, Israel Zangwill. I apologize, I don't have a slide for this guy. But basically in the 1920s, he was writing op-eds in newspapers and giving speeches in front of journalists, talking openly about the benefits that transfer would bring to the native population. That transfer being the word that was used at the time to refer to what we would today describe as ethnic cleansing. But basically, he was talking about it openly. And then Palestinian Arabs would be citing him in their proclamations, in their declarations, in their protest notes to the British as evidence that the Zionist immigration to Palestine has ultimately very nefarious aims, that they are ultimately seeking to displace us. And then I think the Zionist movement realized at that point that it was best to keep quiet about transfer talks. And so I think, from the lessons learned from Israel Zangwill in the 20s, Zionists tended to keep quiet about these things. But Chaim Weizmann, who is the leader of the Zionist movement abroad, he's based in London. He obviously plays a key role in getting the British government to embrace the Balfour Declaration. In 1930, he proposes the Weizmann-Rutenberg scheme together with Pinchas Rutenberg, again, calling for the expulsion, in their words, transfer of Palestinian farmers to Transjordan with funding from Jewish financiers. The belief at the time was, if only we can raise enough money, then we can compel the British to accept this plan. In 1930, he told the British that a transfer of the Arab population of Palestine was desirable. Quote, a quasi-exchange of population could be fostered and encouraged. It had been done with signal success under the agencies of the League of Nations in the cases of the Greeks and the Turks. I'm not entirely sure the Greeks and the Turks themselves would agree that the population transfer that took place in Turkey and Greece in the 1920s was a, quote, success, but nevertheless, this was the belief at the time. In 1930, Weizmann also proposed creating a development company which would acquire 1 million dunams of land in Transjordan, today Jordan, and that they would establish a reserve and relieve Palestine from pressure should any exist. One thing I should have mentioned, perhaps on the previous slide, was that already in the 1890s, you have Theodor Herzl write in his diary in 1891, I believe. So even before he is, or maybe it's 1896, but basically he says in his diary, with regard to the native population, we should spirit the penniless population across the border. That he realizes that already in the 1890s, that Zionism has a fundamental problem, which is that there's people already living in Palestine, and Herzl is obviously well aware of that. Chaim Weizmann is only I would say the next major Zionist leader to really go all in on transfer. As you can see here, he is making written proposals to the British in 1930. Another important Zionist leader who makes these calls, proposes transfer throughout the 1930s, is a guy by the name of Menachem Ushishkin, and he works for the Jewish National Fund, the JNF. I believe he leads that organization in the 30s and 40s, and he is behind major land acquisitions in the north, in the Jezreel Valley, in Beit Sha'an, and it's usually those Zionist leaders who are themselves involved in the acquisition of land. They are almost always the most bullish on transfer because they're well aware of what happens when you buy land that is already inhabited by other people and you want to transfer it to Jewish hands, to Jewish control. Well, guess what? You need to expel the native inhabitants. And so wouldn't it be great if we can just do this in mass? That would make it so much easier to acquire land. And so it's not just Ushishkin who supports a transfer, but it's also obviously Yosef Weiss, which we'll get to on the next slide. In April 1930, so Ushishkin calls for the transfer of Arabs openly. He gives a public address to journalists, picking up that Israel Zangel strain of Zionism of just talking about transfer openly. Quote, if there are other inhabitants there, they must be transferred, there being in Palestine, they must be transferred to some other place. We must take over the land. We have a greater and nobler ideal than preserving several 100,000 Arab fallaheen. So this is very much the rhetoric of the time. It's that Zionist leaders see themselves as the vanguards of civilization in the Middle East. In fact, Herzl even says this directly in the 1890s. He says, in his book, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, he says directly, Zionism is a Western rampart, in the East, in the barbaric East, in the backwards East, where you have a couple 100,000 Arab peasants. We have a nobler mission. Our mission is historic. We are returning Jews to Palestine after thousands and thousands of years of exile. And this is the attitude embraced. And so, who cares about the natives? They just don't matter as much as our noble mission. In 1936, he says, quote, the Arabs do not want us because we want to be the rulers. I will fight for this. I will make sure that we will be the landlords of this land because this country belongs to us, not to them. And in 1937, he proposes to the Peel Commission that they call for the expulsion of 60,000 Arab families to Palestine. It is most moral. Recall the Peel Commission is a commission of inquiry by the British. About 9 months into the revolt, you have an Arab revolt that begins in the spring, in April and May of 1936, and for 9 months, the native inhabitants of the land go on a complete strike. They shut down Palestine's economy for the better part of a year. And that leads the British to say, what went wrong? How do we fix this problem? And so they entertain all of these testimonies from different Zionist leaders and other British officials and even Arabs who present before the Peel Commission. And then the Peel Commission actually proposes one solution is transfer. So the Zionists actually love the Peel Commission, at least the parts of it that talk about transfer, because it then kind of gives them somewhat of an international, some kind of legitimacy to be talking about transfer openly. And you see here, Ushishkin is one of them. Excuse me. So you have Yosef Weiss, who I just mentioned on the previous slide, but he, you could say, is really the champion of the transfer idea. He is, again, he runs the JNF in the 40s. or he's the land director of the JNF. He actually is appointed head of a transfer committee. That is the name of the committee that is set up in May 1948 to manage the expulsion of Palestinian Arabs from their homes and prevent their return. We'll get into that in a subsequent slide. But I just wanted to point out that he is heading that transfer. Already in 1937, he advocated for the expulsion of the Arab population from the area allotted to the Zionists in the Peel Commission. In 1940, he wrote, "If the Arabs leave the country will become wide and spacious for us. The only solution is a land of Israel without Arabs. There is no room here for compromises. There is no way but to transfer the Arabs to the neighboring countries, to transfer them all, save perhaps for the Arabs of Bethlehem, Nazareth, and Old Jerusalem. Not one Arab village must be left." And so let's get to Ben-Gurion's thinking on transfer, because as you well know, Ben-Gurion is the head of the political body within the Zionist community of Palestine. So you could say he is the equivalent of the Zionist prime minister throughout the 1930s and 40s. So his views obviously matter a great deal. In the 1930s, he suggested, quote, "If the Arabs would leave Palestine and Transjordan to the Jews, they could count on Jewish help for resettling the displaced Palestinians in other countries." And so again, this is a very common theme that reemerges, right? It's, wow, we're going to be so generous and help you resettle in a new country after having stripped away your means of livelihood, destroyed your village or your town or your city, and expelled you to a foreign place. But you're going to be happy about it because we're going to help you with the resettlement process. This is a reoccurring theme that will occur many times later in Israeli history. In 1937, so Ben-Gurion, according to his biographer, Ben Zohar, it's very clear what Ben-Gurion's position was. It was desirable to have as few Arabs as possible in the land that would eventually come under the control of the Jews. In 1937, at the 20th Zionist Congress, Ben-Gurion said, the transfer of Arab villagers had been practiced all along. He said, quote, "Was the transfer of Arabs ethical, necessary, and practical? Well, transfer of Arabs had repeatedly taken place before in consequence of Jews settling different districts." He's saying, look, if we proactively transfer Arabs out of Palestine, if we proactively ethnically cleanse Palestine of its indigenous inhabitants, well, it's not all that different from what we've already been doing for the previous many decades, right? We've already been buying up land and then evicting the Palestinians living there. So what's the big difference? So he's trying to basically say there's not a whole lot new here. This is fundamental to the Zionist enterprise. He says in the 1940s, "It is impossible to imagine a general evacuation order, a general evacuation without brutal compulsion. It would be very difficult to bring about resettlement of the fellahin and the urban populations in neighboring Arab countries by transferring them voluntarily." So he's aware that the native inhabitants are not going to leave on their own. That if you want them to leave, well, you're going to probably have to force them out. And then, as I said already, it is clear, even his biographer, who is, by the way, no critic of Ben-Gurion, his biographer is an admirer of Ben-Gurion. It's very obvious in the instructions he gave to his subordinates throughout his entire career as head of the Yishuv and then prime minister of Israel, that it would be desirable if as few Arabs as possible would remain in the territory of the Jewish state. So let's get into what actually happened in 47 and 48. So recall you have the partition plan of 47, and in December, and so immediately after the announcement of that partition plan, which allots 56% of the country to 33% of the people who live in the country, the Zionists, who own 6% of the land, and the only reason they own 6% of the land is through a policy of anti-democratic rule in Palestine for 30 years, which rejected the political will of the overwhelming majority of the native inhabitants. So it's only through those deeply unethical, deeply anti-democratic, deeply inequitable policies that led to the partition plan in the first place. But in any case, that immediately led to an outbreak of violence, and so you already have a war taking place between the Jews of Palestine and the Palestinian Arabs of Palestine in December 1947. And it's in this context that Ben-Gurion writes, the strategic objective was to destroy the urban communities, the most organized and politically conscious sections of the Palestinian people. This was done by the conquest of and destruction of the rural areas surrounding most of the towns. Deprived of transportation, food, and raw materials, the urban communities underwent a process of disintegration, chaos, hunger, which forced them to surrender, and surrender oftentimes meant expulsion. In January 48, Ben-Gurion said it was desirable to transfer Arabs out of the land controlled by Jews. In April, the Zionist leadership adopts a plan that infamously has become known as Plan Dalet, which calls for the establishment of a Jewish state through a military offensive. And that military offensive would essentially be going village to village, especially in the border areas of this new state. And any Palestinian who is not accepting basically Zionist domination, any type of resistance at all, would be expelled, would be depopulated. And in fact, the reality is that in many cases, perhaps you might even say most cases, it didn't matter whether those Palestinians were hostile to Zionist rule or actually whether they were not hostile at all. They oftentimes faced the same fate, which was mass expulsion, which we're going to get to in the next slide. In May 1948, the Zionist communities declared statehood, which is immediately recognized. And then in May 48, Ben-Gurion agreed to put whites in charge of this proposal, of a proposed transfer committee, which was then set up in May 48 to prevent Arabs from returning. Because as we'll get to in the subsequent slide, that these expulsions had already started in the previous few months in March and April and May. They established the transfer committee in May, whose goal it is to prevent the Palestinian Arabs who had already left their home either voluntarily because they were fleeing a war, or they left because they were expelled by direct Zionist military action, or they left because they were afraid of being expelled or worse, massacred by Zionist forces. They were all prevented from returning to their homes. And in fact, one of the strategies from preventing Palestinians from returning to their homes was by settling Jews in those empty villages or destroying the villages altogether. Thus, there would be no vacuum and there would be no possibility of return. And let's talk a bit more about the ethnic cleansing operations themselves. So, Zionist forces expelled something like the estimates vary between 700,000 and as many as 800,000. I think 750,000 is a good estimate of the number of Palestinian Arabs expelled from their homes during the war. The estimates on the number of villages destroyed ranges between 400 and 553. And so, like I said, the expulsions begin already in the very early months of the war. Basically, already in January and February and March, Zionist forces are expelling Palestinian Arabs from the from the coast, from Tantura, Jaffa, and then, Jaffa is not until April. Tiberias, they're already expelling Palestinians from Tiberias in the north. And then by July, they're expelling Palestinians from the central parts of the country, places like Lid and Ramla, in one expulsion order alone, given directly by Ben-Gurion, 35,000 Palestinians. And some estimates, I've seen 70,000 Palestinians, but many, many tens of thousands of Palestinians living in these reasonably large towns of Lid and Ramla are driven on a perilous march to Ramallah. They're tens of kilometers, a perilous march from their homes. And then, of course, in the fall, Israeli forces expel Palestinians from the south and from places like Beersheba. And then they also, in the last military operation of the war, they go into the north in October and November and expel some 200,000 Palestinians from the Galilee during Operations Khidam and Yoav in October 48. And I think there were many causes of the flight. As we said already, there's a war, so people want to, take shelter in someplace safer, and that was the case with many Palestinians. Obviously, direct Zionist expulsion. In fact, during I think it was in June of 1948, the Zionists produced a document where they try to explain what has led to transfer to date. what has led Palestinians to leave their homes. And the top two reasons were direct Zionist military action, um, or basically indirect Zionist military action. In other words, people were afraid of a massacre, and so they left. But essentially, they are already saying in June that the main reason is their own doing. They are the ones driving out Palestinians from their homes. But I think regardless of the reasons Palestinians left, the reason it is fair to call this kind of a mass ethnic cleansing operation is because no one was allowed to return to their home, right? In the aftermath of the war, really from essentially already during the war, Palestinians are being prevented from returning. So you have there's a period of about a month or two in July, August, when there's a truce. There's basically a temporary truce between the Arab armies who had joined the war effort, who had invaded Palestine already in May. They together with the Palestinian guerrilla forces, they signed this. They agreed to a temporary truce, and during that period, already in July 48, you have many Palestinians who had fled who are trying to return to their homes. Right? They want, and in most cases, they're trying to harvest crops. The summer season being the season where you're harvesting the vegetables, you're harvesting the fruits, is really the key harvesting season for Palestinians. So they're going back to harvest these crops that they had abandoned. And that was when the Zionists realized, aha, we need a much more a plan to prevent all of these Palestinians from coming back. And so in the years from 1949 to 1956, the Israeli army adopts a shoot-to-kill policy of anyone trying to return home. And they kill something like 2,700 to 5,000 Palestinians from 49 to 56, the vast majority of whom are unarmed. And this is, by the way, research of Benny Morris in his Border Wars book. So we're not by no these numbers are basically Israeli military figures. This is coming from the Israeli military archives. The true number may actually be quite higher. But these are, for the most part, again, the overwhelming majority of these Palestinians are unarmed. They are refugees trying to return to their homes after a war, as refugees so often do, and they're gunned down. They're murdered in cold blood. And so I think regardless of the reasons Palestinians left in 47 and 48, the fact that they were shot when they tried to return, I think in my view is evidence that this is it's Israel that is making them refugees. It's not that they were made refugees by a war. If that was the case, then they would be allowed back. No, they were intentionally made refugees, and they were not being allowed back, which means Israel bears a responsibility, which means Israel bears responsibility for the ethnic cleansing that took place during the war. The number let's see here. The final thing I want to say on this slide is that there were Palestinians that took their cases to the Israeli Supreme Court to fight for the right to return. This was the case. Raja Shahade was a lawyer in 48, and he actually won a case in front of the Israeli Supreme Court, in which these Palestinian residents of the villages of Kfar Biraim and Ikrit, they surrendered to the Israeli military in November. They were given a promise that they would be allowed to return 15 days later. Of course, they were not allowed to return. Shahada took the course to the Supreme Court, won the court case, but the army refused to enforce the judgment. And so he says Israeli justice. And so I guess it's a democracy if you're Jewish, but if you're Palestinian, and then the army just refuses to listen to the Israeli Supreme Court, I'm not really sure how that's a democracy. So I guess the question is, democracy for who? I want to talk a bit about 1956 and 57, because this is not a well-appreciated period of Israeli-Palestinian history. But in 1956, Britain and France want to reoccupy the Suez Canal. In the war later became known as the Suez Crisis, and they want Israel's help. And so they enlist Israel, and Israel, I guess, is happy to, join this neo-colonial invasion of Egypt. And so, because what does Israel want? Israel wants to occupy the Gaza Strip. Why? Because in addition to all of those unarmed Palestinian refugees who were trying to return to their homes, peaking in 1952, You have also, in response to the gruesome violence that is being perpetrated by the Israeli military against these Palestinians seeking to return home, in response to that, those Palestinians, you have a kind of armed resistance. And so you have these cross-border raids. And so when Israel joins Britain and France in this military invasion of Egypt, because they want to root out that armed resistance in Gaza. In fact, their goal is to, quote, eradicate Palestinian militant resistance, the Fedayeen, who are based in Gaza. And in fact, they join the war effort. They occupy Gaza for about 5 months, from October 56 until about March 57. And during that time period, Ben-Gurion sets up a committee to review proposals for how to depopulate the Gaza Strip. And the Palestinian feeling at the time, so when Israel entered Gaza in 56, they enter the Khan Yunis refugee camp. They go door to door, round up all the men above the age of 15, line them up in the city center of Khan Yunis, and massacre them. It was an execution. And the goal, according to Palestinians, of these, and they did the same thing in Rafah, by the way. They didn't kill quite as many people, about 100 in Rafah, about 200 in Khan Yunis. And as a result of this brutal violence, you get 1,000 Palestinians that flee the Gaza Strip during the 56 invasion. But 1,000 relative to the 750,000 from just 8 years earlier, well, this is just a drop in the bucket. And so, although Ben-Gurion was thrilled by the specter of the victory, of how easy it was to occupy Gaza, he was shocked to discover that Palestinians, for the most part, did not flee the IDF, as had been the case in 1948. And that was what led him to set up this transfer committee to try and consider different proposals for how to empty Gaza of its refugees. And there were proposals entertained to consider Sinai and Iraq and all these, Latin America, which we surfaced in the subsequent years. But so anyways, U.S. President Eisenhower, of course, forces Israel to withdraw from Gaza, and that puts an end to these transfer proposals. But 1967, so just a decade later, Israel, in a surprise attack, Israel carries out, in 6 days, conquers the West Bank and Gaza. And during those operations, Israel made another 250,000 Palestinians refugees, about 45,000 of whom were from the Gaza Strip. They made another 13,000 Palestinians displaced within the territories during the war. And I would say the operations were focused on the Jordan Valley. 88% of the Palestinians displaced during this war were displaced from the Jordan Valley. They emptied entire refugee camps. They bombarded many of these Palestinian villages, both on the border, the Green Line, basically, area, but primarily in Area C, the Jordan Valley, what is today Area C of the West Bank. And then after the war ended, they organized buses for 200,000 Palestinians departing from Jerusalem and other parts of the West Bank to the border with Jordan, forcing those Palestinians to sign documents saying they were leaving voluntarily, and then of course they were never allowed back. In the immediate 3 or 4 years after 67, Israeli officials openly discussed ethnically cleansing Gaza of its Palestinians. The focus during the war was actually on the West Bank, but the focus after the war was on Gaza. And so in 1967, Yosef Weiss advocated for expelling Gaza's refugees to the West Bank. The idea was that you'd give the West Bank, at least part of it, back to Jordan, and in some agreement that would require Jordan to demilitarize it. Because there were so many Palestinians in Jordan. I mean, so why is the focus on Gaza rather than the West Bank? It's a curious question. Number one, Gaza has, 75% of Gaza's population in 1967 are refugees, and Israel's totally obsessed with these refugees, right? Because they've been trying to return for the past 20 years, right? Their homes are on the other side of the border, and they're living in these squalid conditions in these refugee camps in Gaza. So it's obvious they want to return. They're trying to return, and so Israel's obsessed with figuring out ways of getting these Gaza Palestinians somewhere else. And by the way, there just aren't as many of them as well. There's many fewer in Gaza than there are the West Bank, even if as a percentage of the population, it's much greater. And then, so Israel establishes a resettlement agency. And during the year 1967, they actually compel something like 32,000 Palestinians to leave, to leave Gaza. They induce them, they entice them, offering them, benefits if they leave. Israel also compelled hundreds of Palestinians to accept one-way tickets to here's the Latin American option to Paraguay, Brazil, Libya. A Libyan an Israeli agency promised them farmland or property abroad. They helped them get passports. That whole operation came to an end when many of these promises went unfulfilled, and a Palestinian assassinated Israeli ambassador, the secretary of the Israeli ambassador in Paraguay in 1970, and that put an abrupt end to the plan. But this plan was operational for a few years. From 67, basically from 68 to 70, they convinced many hundreds of Palestinian families to go to Latin America. Again, based on this agreement that they would never be allowed back. And then in 1970-71, Israel shifted gears after the assassination and basically just went on. I would basically call it a home demolition campaign. They entered the Gaza Strip. It's Ariel Sharon who's leading this effort, by the way. And they're expanding roads, they're creating security zones. They demolished thousands of homes in Gaza and leaving 16,000 people homeless. Most of them are expelled to El Arish and North Sinai. This is in 1970 and 1971. Now I want to talk a bit about the situation of the Palestinians who remained within the borders of the state of Israel after 1948. So as you recall, we're talking about 150,000 Palestinians, most of whose property is confiscated, by the way. 75% of their property is confiscated because most of those 150,000 are IDPs. They're internally displaced peoples. They're originally from Haifa. They wind up in Jaffa after the war. Their property is taken over in Haifa. They're not allowed to reclaim it. These Palestinians are effectively prohibited from owning or leasing 80 to 93% of the land of Israel to this day. And the 80% is an estimate of the land of Israel's land in control of Jewish regional councils. Jewish towns under their authority basically do not in practice sell land or property to Arabs. And the excuse that is often given by these admissions committees associated with these Jewish regional councils, right? Because if you want to move to, basically a kibbutz or a moshav or one of these rural communities in Israel, there will be a regional council and there will be an admissions committee. It's not that anyone can just move there and buy land. You have to get approved by the admissions committee of the town. And the excuse often given is that Arabs lack suitability to social life in a small community or agricultural settlement. And that is why 99.6% of people living on this land are Jewish. And then the 13% is an estimate of the land of Israel that is controlled by the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, whose mission is all about buying up land and securing it for and developing it for the benefit of Jews. And then since 67, you've had in East Jerusalem, you've had 15,000 Palestinians basically stripped of their residency permits. So let's just zoom out. Recall that in 1967, when Israel, when it conquered Gaza and the West Bank, within a week and a half of the war's end, it annexed this massive territory of about 70 square kilometers that became known as East Jerusalem. Of course, most of those that land was actually not really Jerusalem, but it was just Israel kind of, I would say, going for a land grab. If we can just, if Jerusalem is now all of a sudden 10 times as big as it was before, well, then we can claim we're, just annexing Jerusalem. We're not annexing the West Bank. And so that's what Israel did. But it didn't. So it annexed the land, but not the people, right? This is, we want the land, but not the people living on it. And so the people living in there in East Jerusalem were never granted Israeli citizenship. Instead, they were granted residency permits. Which, of course, can be stripped away from them. And over the past few decades, especially since the 1990s, Israel has been aggressively stripping Palestinians of their right to live in East Jerusalem for the reason that Israel does not want, Israel wants to preserve a Jewish supermajority in the city of Jerusalem. They want at least 60% of Jerusalem to be Jewish for, I think, obvious reasons. And so as a result of that policy, they've adopted all of these draconian laws and regulations to figure out ways of stripping Palestinians of their residency permits. The new law, that kind of the new regulation from the 2000s onwards, was Palestinians need to be able to prove that their center of life is East Jerusalem. And if they can't prove that, then they can get their residency stripped away from them. Israel also prevents Palestinians from building homes in most areas of East Jerusalem. Basically, they drew lines around all the built-up areas of the city when they conquered it in 67, and said, Palestinians, you're only allowed to build within those already built up areas. Of course, the vast majority of the 70 square kilometers that was annexed to Israel in 1967 was sparsely populated, right? You're talking about a massive area. There's large areas of land where there's no one living on. All of those lands were declared, industrial zones, nature zones, or they were just declared state land and then slated for Jewish development. But basically, Palestinians were prevented from building it on those areas. And again, all of this is a strategy to push Palestinians out of Jerusalem. And then the other thing that Israel did was in 1970, it passed a law that said if you're Jewish and you owned property in that 70 square kilometers of East Jerusalem before 1948, you can go reclaim it. In fact, you don't even need to have owned that property yourself. As long as another Jew owned that property, and then you bought that land from that other Jew, then you can go and basically evict the native inhabitants, the people living on that land. You can evict them. And that is the process that is used in places like Sheikh Jarrah, in Silwan, in Wadi Joz, in the Old City, in all of these neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. That is the law that is used to kick everybody out of their homes, people who have been living there since 1948. You're talking generations of families. But of course, Palestinians who owned land in West Jerusalem before 48, well, of course, they're not allowed to go back and evict the Jews from their homes. And so it's a blatantly racist law, but it is used to evict hundreds, thousands of Palestinians from Jerusalem. And you have currently 970 people facing those eviction orders in East Jerusalem. And then the final community that is facing displacement and ethnic cleansing is the Palestinian community. I'm talking within the borders of the state of Israel is the Palestinian Bedouins, who live primarily in the southern part of the country. Their villages, something like 60 some odd Palestinian Bedouin villages, are not even recognized by the state of Israel. They're just, basically Israel says we don't recognize these as municipalities within the state. So they're not connected to the Israeli water grid. They don't have health services or bus services or electricity services. They're unrecognized peoples, and they're constantly facing the force of this forced displacement. And as you saw, literally, was it 2 days ago? You saw an entire Palestinian Bedouin village in the south of Israel being demolished, being live streamed, being demolished, in real time, live. Just people being uprooted from their homes for having committed the crime of being born a native inhabitant of the southern region. Let's also talk about Israel's longstanding policy of denying Palestinians within Israel. These are the Palestinian citizens of Israel, denying them the right to family reunification. So, of course, if you're a Jew, a Jewish citizen of Israel, you can marry anyone you want and bring them to Israel. And they'll get citizenship. But if you're Palestinian and you want to marry a Palestinian from the occupied Palestinian territories, you cannot bring your loved one, your spouse, into Israel. Between 1973 and 1982, Israel approved just 9,000 out of 150,000 such reunification requests. In fact, they don't have to be a loved one. They could be a brother or sister. So if you're a Palestinian in Jaffa, and you in 1973 or 1982, you want to bring your Palestinian sister or mother or father from Gaza or from the West Bank to Tel Aviv, to Jaffa, to Haifa, wherever you are, you would, there's a 9 out of 10 chance that you're going to be banned from unifying with your family. And then beginning in the 80s, Israel basically, significant. If you think that was a poor odds, after 1983, your odds went down to roughly zero. They basically stopped approving these family reunification requests. And the reason, again, was quite obvious. The goal is to pressure Palestinians in Israel to leave. Again, part of Israel's depopulation efforts. And then in 2000, what Israel did was it froze the Palestinian population registry. So you have so Israel has been in control. You'll often hear this said, Israel is in control of the Palestinian population registry of the West Bank and Gaza. Meaning if you want an ID card, that is basically under the control of Israel, right? If you want a card that's just like, I am a resident of the West Bank, I am a resident of Gaza, I have a travel document that says I can travel abroad. Those documents are under the control of the Israeli government. Even despite Azov, despite the PA, it's Israel that ultimately controls that. And Israel froze those registries. And so the result of that freezing was that children of West Bank Palestinians who were born overseas, let's say if you were a West Bank Palestinian, you gave birth, you had a child in Mexico, in the United States, and then you try bringing your child back, they do not have residency status in the West Bank. Same is true of foreign spouses or of Gazan Palestinians living in the West Bank. They're not given residency status. They're not allowed to be an occupied person. They're just they're basically completely documentless. And this freeze has placed tens of thousands of Palestinians under a constant threat of deportation. Again, the reason is always the same. It's we don't want Palestinians living in anywhere in historic Palestine. Wouldn't it be great if they just left? We don't want to force them to leave or evict them. It's hard to do that. That's just much harder. It's much easier to create all of these, bureaucratic and assassin policies to just push them out slowly. Israel is very patient, willing to do it slowly. Just have a couple of slides. I'm going to wrap up in just a few minutes. But the other thing I want to point out here is that Israel also has a longstanding policy of destroying Palestinian homes. Since 1967, Israel has destroyed 28,000 Palestinian homes in the West Bank, and that has led to 100,000 Palestinians displaced. In 2022, Israel demolished 953 Palestinian structures in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. That was the highest numbers since 2016, displacing another 1,000 people. Israel concentrates its home demolitions in the South Hebron Hills, in the Jordan Valley, in the E1 zone that connects Jerusalem, Ma'ale Adumim, and then to the Dead Sea, and of course in East Jerusalem. From 2016 to 2018, Israel issued 100 times more demolition orders to Palestinians living in Area C of the West Bank than they issued building permits to Palestinians in Area C of the West Bank. In other words, you were 100 times more likely to have an Israeli hand you a home demolition order than you were to have an Israeli approve your request to build a home in what is 60% of the West Bank. And then, of course, all of these policies have gotten dramatically worse since October 7th. Israel has demolished 115 homes in the West Bank, displacing another 700 people. That was as of January, so that data point is actually out of date. I imagine the number is already much higher. Let's talk a bit about the ethnic cleansing operations that have in a bit more detail. I gave you an overview on the last slide, but in November, basically Israel is going around to primarily these shepherding communities. That has been the target in the past 2 years. So you have all these shepherding communities in places like Khibret Khumsa, in places like Ain Samia, in places like Ras Tin, in Wadi Asik and Livjim. These are primarily Palestinian shepherding communities scattered all around the West Bank, who are being essentially ethnically cleansed almost on a monthly or a basis for the past couple of years. In 2022, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that 1,000 Palestinians in Masaf Yatta could be displaced in the largest expulsion decision since 1967. And then, and since October 7th, the attacks on those Palestinians in those villages are now taking place on a daily basis. And so if you go to Masaf Yatta, which is a Palestinian town in the South Hebron Hills, you will be attacked by an Israeli settler, most likely accompanied by Israeli soldiers, every single day. I've seen this myself in Khumsa. You have Palestinian shepherds. They are taking their sheep to flock on the mountains, and then you have Israeli settlers coming up to them, attacking their sheep, entering their homes, intimidating them, physically assaulting them, destroying their water tanks, destroying their solar panels, slashing the tires of their cars, committing acts of vandalism and assault. And it's all taking place under the eye, and in many cases, the Israeli soldiers are present, and usually they're intervening on behalf of the settlers carrying out the acts of terrorism and violence. And this is leading to all of these Palestinians being forced out of their villages. So we're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. Since October 7th alone, more than 200 Palestinian households have been displaced. 1,200 people have been ethnically cleansed from their villages, forced to find some other place to live. And I believe this is my last slide. I want to talk briefly about the depopulation policy that has been taking place since October 7th in the Gaza Strip. You're all well aware. Actually, let me just say before getting into the events since October 7th as they relate to Israel's depopulation policy, it's not well appreciated, but in the 16-year siege that Israel imposed on Gaza leading up to October 7th, many, many thousands, if not tens of thousands of Palestinians had left the Gaza Strip. Okay, this was a very a silent migration, a silent depopulation, because what were Palestinians in Gaza doing for the previous 16 years? They were getting on boats and braving the high seas, hoping for a better life in Europe for the same reasons that other migrants and other refugees have been getting on boats, braving the high seas, trying to cross the Mediterranean. The Syrians did it, the Lebanese did it, the Somalis did it, the Eritreans did it, and the Gazans also did it. And we don't know the numbers because it's all obviously like taking place under the cover of darkness at night. Very hard to get accurate numbers, but Palestinians in Gaza I've spoken to all say they know someone. Everyone knows someone who has left in the years preceding October 7th. And the reasons are obvious, right? It's an open air prison. 50% of households are living in extreme poverty. This is obviously before October 7th, right? So you're talking about a dire situation. And so that was forcing out Palestinians as well. Again, if you make life miserable enough for Palestinians in Gaza, they will figure out a way of leaving. And that is exactly what had been happening in the previous 16 years. But of course, on October 7th, since October 7th, Israeli plans to ethnically cleanse all 2.3 million people from Gaza to North Sinai were leaked. This was a document that was leaked associated with a think tank, associated with the Israeli military. But it's very clear, just leaving aside that document, what is clear based on Israel's policy during the past 7 months is that the goal is to make a return impossible. The Palestinians who are in Rafah are being shot at when they try to return to the north. Their homes are being completely demolished. Something like 80% of the homes in Gaza have either been partially or completely destroyed. Well, I mean, just think about that. You're talking about the entirety of the housing stock is being leveled to the ground. And why is that? Well, it's obvious because Israel doesn't want them to return. And if there's nowhere to return to, if there are no homes left, if there are no schools left, Israel has destroyed hundreds of schools. If there are no hospitals left, out of the 37 hospitals in Gaza, all but 12 are completely destroyed, and then the remaining 12 are partially functional. So you're talking about a population that has no access to education, has nowhere to live, there's no shelter, all the homes have been destroyed, has no access to healthcare. Well, that is how you force a population out. And so I think one of the main reasons Israel is just destroying anything and everything is because the ultimate goal of this operation is to push as many Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip. Maybe they're leaving through Rafah. And in fact, one estimate, and it's again very hard to get exact numbers here, but one estimate is that something like 40,000 Palestinians have already left Gaza in the past 7 months. In the past few days, Israel has taken over the Rafah crossing and prevented a flight, but for this impending invasion of Rafah. But over the previous 7 months, Rafah was open, and you could leave if you had $5,000, the salary for an entire year of an average Gazan. So again, Israel's policy making life in Palestine impossible, incentivizing flight. And I believe on that note, I will end my presentation. Let me end my screen share. And I believe the idea is I apologize if I went over a bit. I believe we are going to flip to a Q&A. So I will stop speaking now, and I believe we're going to have a kind of a moderated Q&A.
Thank you, Zach, for just a wonderful presentation to help us understand the whole sweep of depopulation, and which continues to today. And we have some very good questions, and I would like to start with this one. When mentioning Nakba while discussing with Zionists, they often respond with an expulsion of Jewish people from Arab countries. It is a bit of a whataboutism. But are those events somehow symmetrical? And how are the rights of expulsed Jewish people in those Arab countries?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I very much agree with the the sentiment expressed that this is very much a whataboutism. I'm not entirely sure how Israel's culpability with the expulsion of Palestinians in 48 has anything to do with the discriminatory policies that were embraced by many, many Arab and Muslim countries in the aftermath of the 48 war. You had around the Arab and Muslim world, you had Arab leaders, Muslim leaders, embraced all of these discriminatory policies against Jews, right? It happened in Egypt, it happened in Morocco, it happened in Iraq, it happened everywhere. Basically, wherever you had Jews, you had essentially retribution against Jews. And by the way, we see the same against Palestinian Americans. You had multiple Palestinian Americans either killed or paralyzed or wounded or attacked since October 7th as retribution for what happened on October 7th. And then whenever Israel goes on campaigns of aerial bombardment and mass slaughter in Gaza, oftentimes you get a spike in anti-Semitism. That happened in 2008 and 2014. By the way, when Japan attacked the United States on Pearl Harbor, the United States, put Japanese in internment camps. Retribution. When the war broke out, when COVID broke out, you had Americans calling it, you had Donald Trump calling it the China virus, and then you had a rise in anti-Asian hate. So I think it's important here to remember that there's nothing unique or particular about a community facing violent retribution whenever their community is perceived to have carried out some act of violence. So I say all that just to say I don't think there's anything unique or exceptional here about what happened with the Jews around the Arab world when the state of Israel expelled 750,000 Palestinians from their homes in 48. But there's no question, but make no mistake, that does not justify what the Arab countries did. That does not justify at all the treatment that Jews faced. And it wasn't just on the parts of their governments. They also faced pogroms. You had pogroms all around. You had pogroms in Egypt. You had pogroms in Libya. You had pogroms in Syria. You had pogroms in Yemen. So Jews faced violence and retribution and discrimination. And that led them, in many, if not most cases, to leave. Now, by the way, one thing people don't like to tell you is that many, if not most of those Jews didn't want to go to Israel. They wanted to go to Europe. They wanted to go to they were forced out, but that didn't mean they had a desire to go to Israel. That was just the country that was accepting them. But in fact, in North Africa, many of the Moroccan and the Algerian and the Tunisian and the Libyan Jews, they went to France. They didn't go to Israel. So if they had alternative options, they oftentimes took those. But I'm not sure I addressed that question completely. But that is what I would say about about the expulsion, you could say, or the flight of the Jews from Arab and Muslim countries.
Thank you. And here's a broad historical sweep of a question. Where were Israel's borders and what was its population of these areas in ancient times? For example, when Jesus was alive, and why did these boundaries/borders change? Basically, why did the Israelis leave for other European countries?
Gotcha. So during the lifetime of Jesus Christ, there was no Israeli kingdom. Jesus was he was born in Roman Palestine, right? So Palestine was part of the Roman Empire. There was no Israelite kingdom during Jesus' lifetime. So I'm not entirely sure. I think that the question makes sense. But look, as far as the ancient Israelite kingdoms, that's a very good question. Like this is kind of a bit beyond my area of expertise, but you can look at these maps. You have in the 19th century, you have Europeans printing these Bible maps, and you do get a sense of basically like the 13 tribes of Israel, the 12 tribes. Basically, what is today essentially, a pretty similar map to what is today essentially Israel, Palestine, and maybe Transjordan, or what is today Jordan. I would say that the contemporary image that we have of Israel and Palestine, and again, possibly also including Jordan, and then going up to Sidon. So the ancient Israelite kingdom, I think, extended as far as Sidon, and maybe extended into the southern desert, and maybe even into Jordan, and potentially even small parts of what is today Saudi Arabia. But that would have been the general area, and then different kingdoms, right, would during the period of during the period of the kingdom of David, it would have been slightly different. During the period of, the 12 tribes, it would have been slightly different. During the period of the Kingdom of Solomon, it would have been slightly different. So the borders shifted around a bit. But generally speaking, what we today look at is Israel, Palestine, Jordan. That would have been the ancient Israelite kingdoms.
Thank you. And the next question, what rights do Palestinians have who are living within the state of Israel, the 48 regions, compared to the rights of the Palestinian in the West Bank? Does Israel care about Arab Muslim Palestinians live within their borders? How are they allowed to stay after the Nakba?
Yeah, so, Israel expelled 750,000 Palestinians from their homes, but they didn't expel all Palestinians, right? 150,000 remained. And from 48 to 66, Israel imposed a military regime on them. It's pretty similar to the one that is today imposed on Palestinians in the West Bank. That military regime basically, stripped those Palestinians of freedom of movement. There were checkpoints erected at the entrance and exit points of every Palestinian village inside Israel from 48 to 66, and they needed permits to leave their villages. They needed permits to visit their brother in the next village over. They needed a permit to visit an Israeli town or city. So you're talking about, so the freedom of movement was restricted. The permit, and if they were caught in violation of these laws, they could have their property confiscated. That was oftentimes, I think, the most common kind of Israeli retort to a violation of some, racist law or racist policy is home demolition or property confiscation, because these are the things Israel ultimately wants. It wants Palestinians out of Palestine. So how do you do that? Well, you destroy their home and you take away their property. So yeah, that was the case until 66. But look, from 66, to even including to the present day, yeah, obviously Palestinians, citizens of Israel, they have the right to vote. You have however many Arab, Knesset members. You even had an Arab member of the Israeli Supreme Court. So I would say much of the discrimination takes place. I would say. There obviously there's something like, I think, 60 laws that have been identified by Adaleh, which is the Palestinian human rights organization in Israel, based, I believe, in Haifa, that documents the violations that are taking place against the Palestinian citizens of Israel. So what I would say is there are many laws that discriminate against them, right? Their properties and their land can be confiscated and was confiscated because they were absentee. Of course, that is a law that does not apply to Jews. If you were a Jew at the end of the 48 war and you wound up in Tel Aviv, even though you're originally from the Galilee, well, you can go back to the Galilee and reclaim your property. Whereas the opposite is not the case. If you were a Palestinian, wound up someplace other than where you were originally from, you lost your property. So there are very discriminatory laws. You might even say apartheid laws that discriminate against Palestinian citizens of Israel. Again, at a de jure level, at a legal level. And that is one of them. The 1950 absentee property law. I would say most of the discrimination today is taking place at not so much at a legal level, but it's more so just in housing. How many Palestinian towns have been built by the state of Israel since 48? The answer, I think, one. A new Palestinian development, whereas the state of Israel is constantly building new Jewish neighborhoods, new Jewish cities, new Jewish towns. So housing would be a big one. Education. 1990, according to some data from the 90s, your average pupil, your average Arab pupil, got 1/3 the amount of money as your average Jewish pupil. Okay, so the education system is underfunded. There are thousands of missing classrooms. Then, of course, you have healthcare. Yeah, today, in the state of Israel, an Arab baby is 2.5 times more likely to die in childbirth than a Jewish baby. Okay, so they face discrimination in health, in housing, and education, and employment. They face discrimination. For example, if an Israeli employer wants to hire a Jew rather than an Arab, they just say military service required, right? So and that's very, very common. So they face discrimination in employment. And then, of course, they just face, generally speaking, underrepresentation in all areas of public life. In the Knesset, they're underrepresented. In the media, they're underrepresented. They're underrepresented in public service jobs. the rank and file, the bureaucracy, the state bureaucracy, they're underrepresented because it's discrimination, because Jews don't want to hire Arabs, right? That's the reason. Jews want to hire other Jews. And then ultimately, I would say so the polling varies on this, but somewhere between 25 and 50% of Jewish Israelis, at a deep down, they consider Palestinian Arabs essentially fifth columns as a demographic time bomb. As you know, the fact that you are Palestinian, that you have a pulse, that you can breathe, you are a threat to the state of Israel. Because if you have too many babies, and if the Palestinian Arab community has too many babies, well, they might become the demographic majority one day, which Jewish Israelis consider a security threat. So the fact that I have a Palestinian and I have a pulse makes me a security threat to the Jewish Israelis, according to most of them. So that is the life of a Palestinian inside the state of Israel. Maybe I'll pause there because I've been going on for a while.
Thank you very much. Manju asks, are there any Israeli human rights or civil rights fighting for basic rights of Palestinian residents of Israel and in the West Bank and Gaza?
So the question is, are there Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank fighting for the rights of Palestinians in Israel?
Let me just read it again. I think I can do a better job. Are there any Israeli human rights or civil rights groups fighting for the basic rights of Palestinian residents of Israel and West Bank and Gaza?
Oh, most certainly. Yes, there are many. Israel is, I think, famous for its human rights organizations. You have B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights organization, which document some of the best documentation around the number of fatalities, and the causes of those fatalities in this war. I mean, in the Israel-Palestine question overall, those are B'Tselem numbers. They have the most reliable numbers. And that's an Israeli human rights organization. You obviously have many. You have many dozens. I mean, you have ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, against homeland demolitions. Moked, we're helping Palestinians in Gaza. You have, many Israeli. I mean, obviously, Adala is an Israeli. I mean, you could say it's Palestinian Israeli, but it's an Israeli organization. Yeah. So the answer is yes. There are many.
We have so many good questions. I'm going to have to start combining them. Am I right in suspecting that most U.S. Jewish people are unaware of this brutal history? And then also take a look at how are Israelis educated and informed about this history, or is it simply not mentioned?
Look, the Israeli, so let's start with the American Jews. Look, I think what you are seeing right now is evidence that there are many American Jews, especially young American Jews, who are incredibly disturbed about what's happening, so disturbed that they're the ones leading the protest movement in the United States. Over the past 7 months, I mean, you guys have seen the images of Jewish Voices for Peace, taking over the Statue of Liberty, taking over train stations in New York and DC. These were some of the most vocal protests, some of the most, I would say, effective protests, right, in terms of capturing media attention, of any protest we've seen so far, led by Jews. So, no, Jews are very much at the forefront of the struggle. Obviously, there are, I would say the establishment, think of, the AJC, the American Jewish Committee, the Council of the Presidents, Hillel International, obviously the major movements, United Synagogue, basically the conservative movement, the Reform movement, the Orthodox movement, right? So I would say at the institutional level, certainly older Jews for the most part, certainly Jews who you could call them baby boomers, are much more likely to be somewhat uninformed and to not have a very nuanced view of things, and to be essentially pro-Israeli organizations at their core. That is to say, they believe that the state of Israel is a force for good in the world. Full stop. That is a starting point. It's not really up for debate. Right? The Israeli flag is kind of almost a flag of the Jewish people, they would say, right? They wave Israeli flags in synagogues, in institutions, at the Hillels, right? So this is, you could say, at an institutional level. And again, most of these institutions are run by older Jews, baby boomers, who again grew up in a different world, have not been able to adapt their views, and not been able to evolve their views at the worsening situation. And so yes, the establishment is I would say I'm not sure unaware. Again, the information's all easily available. I'm not telling you anything that you couldn't honestly find out on. Most of the stuff you could just Google and learn on read. I'll send you 100 Wikipedia pages and you could learn all this stuff. I'm not saying anything that's secret information. This is all available in the public. It's just people choose not to educate themselves.
And let's turn to present day. Let's go to Gaza. In your opinion, is the war in Gaza really a furthering of Israel's goal of ethnic cleansing, or are they really going after Hamas?
Well, look, there's a lot of things happening in Gaza, right? It's number one, it's revenge. And you see the videos posted by the soldiers themselves where they're blowing up entire apartment buildings, entire blocks, with the gleeful look in their eye. So there's certainly a matter of revenge that is taking place. There is obviously a desire to destroy Hamas. I wouldn't doubt that. But the question is, how is it that destroying 80% of the housing stock is destroying Hamas, right? When you actually look at the operations that are being carried out, when you look at the policies that are being embraced, which is a shoot to kill policy, they're killing their own hostages, screaming and waving white flags in Hebrew. How is it that they're not even willing to, because it's anything that moves in the kill zones gets, you've seen the 972 reporting that Israel has established kill zones, right? So anything that moves is shot at. There's that, including Israeli hostages, right? So 80% of the housing stock. How do you explain that? If the goal is that we are going after Hamas, how is it that you're literally destroying every single home in Gaza? That's not how you kill Hamas. Hamas is underground. I mean, Israel isn't even willing to go into the tunnels, right? No, as far as we can tell, there have been no Israeli operations inside the tunnels. And that's where the Hamas militants are all based. That's where the headquarters, that's where the Hamas leadership is. They're underground. They're not above ground. So again, if the goal was really to go after Hamas, then, how do you explain all these things? I think the goal, and by the way, this has been leaked. I'm not saying anything that we don't already know. We have hundreds of statements from Israeli leaders themselves saying, Bibi Netanyahu likened the Palestinian people of Gaza to Amalek, the people that the biblical Israelites were commanded to annihilate, not just the militants of Amalek, but everybody, the men, the women, the children, the elderly, the goats, the sheep, the ox. They were commanded to kill everybody. And Bibi Netanyahu likened the enemy to Amalek twice. Bezalel Smotrich likened the enemy to Amalek just a few days ago. Yoav Gallant, no food, no water, no electricity, no fuel. By the way, to everybody. If they were going after Hamas, why are you trying to prevent babies from getting water? Why are you trying to prevent children from getting food if you're trying to go after Hamas? So again, and then we had a leaked a report that basically said the goal is to thin out the north. The goal is to thin out the north. That was Netanyahu saying that. So again, Israel can pretend to go to tell the world that's going after Hamas, but if you actually look at both the statements made by Israeli leaders and then the actions taken on the ground, it's very clear what's happening, which is that they're not going after Hamas, they're going after everybody.
And now a big one. In view of all this, how do we explain President Biden's ongoing support of Israel?
Yeah, how do we explain it? Well, you're talking about a guy who, in 1982, he met with then Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin in the United States on a visit. Begin visited the U.S. And you recall that 1982 invasion, Israel besieged Beirut, killed 5,000 civilians during that siege that lasted 2 months. Slaughtered. Ariel Sharon oversaw the mass slaughter of thousands of Palestinians in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps by the Phalangist militias, right? So after that invasion and that brutality, Menachem Begin comes to the U.S. and Biden tells him, I would have gone further. You didn't go far enough. Okay? This is Biden bragging that he would have killed more civilians in 1982 than Menachem Begin killed. And that was to date the most gruesome violence I think Israel had ever perpetrated against Palestinians, perhaps with the exception of 48. So, Biden, he grew up in the 50s and 60s and 70s when obviously the perception was of a people who had just survived a Holocaust. And so there was no critique of Israel in the 50s. And Israel was perceived to be this little country surrounded by Arabs that all wanted to destroy it. So that's his mentality. And he hasn't been able to evolve that mentality in 50 years. I mean, the guy's what, 80? So of course there's been a lot of research done on this. The older you get, the harder it is to change your views. Okay. And I think we all know that viscerally from our own life experiences. We get set in our ways. You're not going to be able to convince a guy who for his entire adult life believed one thing to believe another thing, even if the facts on the ground change dramatically. And the facts on the ground, by the way, have obviously changed dramatically. And I think that's one of the reasons why the older you are, the more pro-Israel you are, because Israel has become more and more violent over time. Israeli occupation has intensified over time. Israeli settler violence has increased over time. Israeli ethnic cleansing operations have increased over time. So he's unable to evolve his views. I think that's really the biggest issue. And look, there's all this guilt. There's all of this guilt. The United States did nothing during World War II to save Jews. We did nothing. And so there's this belief that, in order to repay our own sins as a country, the UK did nothing. Prevented Jews from going to the UK during World War II. So, and then obviously Germany, the perpetrator of the Holocaust, all of these countries, the United States, UK, I know the question was about Biden, but basically I would say Holocaust guilt plays a big role. And then the final thing to emphasize is the Israel lobby itself. The Israel lobby is set to spend $100 million this campaign season just on Democratic candidates, right? $100 million. They will go after anybody who isn't hook, line, and sinker behind the Israeli government. They will attack you. They will claim you're pro-Hamas. They will try and unseat you. And that is what they are doing. And obviously Biden is in bed with that lobby, right? His team is very much people who have been influenced by that Israel lobby for decades. So I would say that is another key factor as well.
Thank you. That's a big question. And on to another large question. The Hamas attack on October 7th seems suicidal. They know that Israel far exceeds Gaza in military strength. What is your opinion?
I mean, there's no question that that Hamas was clearly prepared for an Israeli counteroffensive, right? They were obviously aware that, look how many. I mean, they basically they've created their own, you could say, indigenous weapons industry, and they're producing weapons underground. And they've been firing these tank missiles, these missiles that can pierce the armor of the Israeli tanks. They've been firing them, consistently to this date. 7 months of war, they're still firing rockets. They had a massive supply, a massive arsenal. They were clearly prepared for a long war. And so there's no question they understood what was coming. Look, what I would say is there are a few things about October 7th that I think, people don't fully appreciate. Number one, the 250 or 350 people or so who were killed at the rave, that was unexpected. Hamas was not even aware there was a rave there. And I think this has been well established. That point is not really debated, right? The rave, they moved the location a few days before. Hamas had no idea there was a rave. So, they were actually going, on their way to the rave. They were going towards in the direction of an Israeli military base. Actually, the headquarters of the Southern Command is based not too far from there. And so I think that actually, I think, the death count was probably higher than they were expecting. And then I don't think they expected to achieve the degree of military success that they achieved on that day. I mean, they broke through the barrier in dozens of different locations. Israel was totally caught off guard. They took over the Eretz crossing. I just don't think they expected to have that degree of success that they had. And then, dozens of people were probably also killed by the Israeli military on October 7th as well. So that contributes to the death count. So, again, I think they had more military success than they expected. So maybe they didn't expect the counteroffensive to be as brutal as it had become. And I think even now what you're hearing from basically everybody is like, no, we've never seen anything like this. We've never seen this degree of Israeli violence. I mean, we're talking about a genocide. You know, we're talking about starving 2 million people to death. Did anyone expect Israel to do that? I certainly didn't. I didn't. I would have never imagined 60% of Jewish Israelis say, we reject humanitarian aid entering the Gaza Strip. I mean, would you have expected that? 60% of Jewish Israelis believe all 2 million Gazans should starve to death? I wouldn't have guessed that. So I just don't think they expected the degree, the amount of revenge, the amount of violent brutality that they've seen. It was hard to predict that.
This is returning to the earlier history that you talked about. We hear that Jews always found safe haven in Muslim lands historically. Were Jews being persecuted or expelled from Muslim countries before the Zionist activities started in Palestine?
I mean, the short answer is no. Look, on the eve of Zionist immigration to Palestine in the 19th century, you were much better off if you were a Jew in Iraq, in Egypt, in Libya, in Morocco, in Turkey, or it was the Ottoman Empire, right? But you were much better off in any of those places than you were in Europe. In Europe, if you were a Jew, you were facing pogroms in the Russian Empire, in Ukraine, in Hungary. And then in Western Europe, you were facing systematic discrimination, the Dreyfus Affair, right? Jews left being prevented from entering Britain in the early 20th century owing to the Aliens Act, keeping Jews out of Britain, right? Just anti-Semitic legislation. So, Jews on average, and I don't think you will find a historian that will disagree with this, on average, did much better under Muslim rule than they did under Christian rule, zooming out, looking at history from a bird's eye view. That is undisputed. Absolutely. I couldn't agree with that statement more. And if I could just add one thing, I mean, just to really drive the point home, in Ottoman Palestine, on the eve of Zionist immigration, you had Jews and Muslims and Christians celebrating Purim together. You had in the 1890s, in the 1900s, 1910s, you have Muslim kids dressing up on Purim. You have, Christians and Muslims joining Jews on picnics to the grave of Shimon HaTzadik, which is located in Sheikh Jarrah. The same neighborhood today where you have Jews ethnically cleansing Palestinians. Just go back 120 years, they were picnicking together and listening to music together and enjoying a holiday together. So, it didn't have to turn out the way it turned out.
This question is one I think that perplexes so many people, and it is. I have heard that the initial report of October 7th Hamas attack was not accurate. For example, some of the infanticide and rapes actually did not happen. Is this true?
All right, maybe if we want to, and yeah, this is a big question. So, did rape happen on October 7th? The United Nations published a report a couple of months ago, in which they interviewed, dozens, potentially hundreds of people. These were interviews that were arranged by the Israeli government. So they spoke with Shin Bet, they spoke with the Israeli military, they spoke with Israeli doctors in Israeli hospitals who were dealing with patients and victims and survivors. They dealt with the Israeli trauma centers. So they got all the evidence. And that report had 3 standards of evidence. Okay. The highest standard of evidence is beyond any reasonable doubt. These are legal definitions. When you're talking about evidence and you're trying to make a case to prosecute someone for a crime, you define evidence in different ways. So the report defines the highest standard of evidence as beyond any reasonable doubt. The second standard of evidence was clear and convincing evidence. And the lowest standard of evidence is reasonable grounds to believe. And then and so what they concluded was there was reasonable grounds to believe that sexual violence took place in 2 locations on October 7th. But they concluded there was not clear and convincing evidence that sexual violence took place on October 7th. Right? So it was the lowest standard of evidence. Now, why? Why? Because there's no victims. We, as to date, don't have a victim. We can't, basically of these eyewitness testimonies, we're unable to even determine which of the victims was raped. So there's and no victims have come forward. The argument is that they were all killed. So we don't have victims. There's no forensic evidence. If you look at basically these, the bodies that, were claimed to be, raped, actually there is no evidence. There's no forensic evidence. And in many cases, the people who are claiming that, oh, the body was in a certain position, it was bloody this way, forensic experts have later come and looked at those photos and say, actually, that's a pretty normal thing that happens after someone dies. It had nothing to do with sexual violence or rape. So that was another point that has been, made. So no victims, no forensic evidence, no direct eyewitness testimony. We don't really have, the eyewitness testimony is, I was behind a bush, I was in a caravan, I heard screams. It was not, I witnessed with my own two eyes. And then when you look at some of the other reporting, for example, the blockbuster New York Times article, Screams Without Words, most of the evidence that has been proffered in that article has been debunked. Gal Abduth, the lead victim who spoke with her family, a few minutes before an hour or two before she was killed, her family says that it was highly unlikely she was raped, despite the New York Times claiming she was raped. Okay, then the second set of rape victims, according to the article, in the Be'eri, in the Be'eri kibbutz, the spokesperson for Be'eri came out and said no rape happened on October 7th. They couldn't even match up the New York Times claimed two people in Be'eri kibbutz were raped on October 7th. The kibbutz head came out and said that was basically misinformation, that never happened. And then they're citing people like Raz Cohen, who changed his testimony multiple times. First, he said in his very first interview, no rape was mentioned. His second interview, he saw multiple rapes. His third interview, he saw one rape. The New York Times quotes him as one rape. So this guy's changing his story 3-4 times. I'm not really sure that's really reliable. At least you want to cite that evidence if you're going to claim there was a rape. And then they quote the Zakah organization. We don't have to get into it, but basically Zakah was responsible for spreading some of the most insidious lies. The 40 beheaded babies, the babies in the ovens. So that New York Times article has completely come under scrutiny. You just had the Washington Post published an article just last week or a few weeks ago, a list of 80 journalism professors basically saying, the New York Times is publishing fiction. So look, was there sexual violence committed on October 7th? Honestly, if I had to guess, I would bet yes, there was. Sporadic isolated incidents here or there. How could there not have been? I mean, 1,100 people killed, gruesome brutality, massacres all over, dropping grenades in bomb shelters where people, all kinds of gruesome things. I would be surprised if there wasn't an incident here or there. But the narrative that has been spewed, which is that there was some premeditated campaign, this was used as a weapon of war, mass rapes all over the place. That narrative is clearly is not supported by the evidence. So that is what I would say about the mass rape allegations on October 7th.
Thank you very much. And we're at time, but there is one question that I would be remiss in not asking you. We're interested to hear more about your background and your journey. So if you would be so kind to close up your time with us with an answer to that question.
Yeah, sure. I come from a Jewish background. I went to Jewish schools growing up, Jewish summer camps, Jewish youth groups. So I grew up in a very Jewish environment. I think at some point I spent more time in Israel, got more interested in Palestine, started learning Arabic, started meeting Palestinians, and the more Israeli, and then I got more interested in history for me. And so for the more history I studied, the more critical of the official Zionist narrative I became. Right? I mean, if you study the history, the more history you study, the more sympathetic you become to the Palestinians. So that was kind of, I would say, and then obviously, traveling around the region, just traveling around Israel and Palestine, kind of just seeing the reality on the ground and seeing what Palestinians deal with on the ground, the checkpoints, the home demolitions, the land confiscations, the brutality, the violence, the vandalism, the domination, really. And so I would say that it's just witnessing things firsthand also that obviously leads you in a certain direction. But yeah, that's what I would say about my background.
Thank you so much for a very interesting, excellent, informative presentation. Fabulous. Thank you so much. And I have a few announcements to wrap up with here. And that is keep your eyes open the June speaker will be announced shortly. And I am happy to tell you that Jeff Helper will be at our July in-person event. I think most know that Jeff is the founder of Israeli Committee Against Home Demolitions and a very compelling speaker, and also a Minnesotan. If you would be so kind as to take a very brief survey after I close, and then if you like what you see, and you can't discount our excellence with this morning's speaker, please donate to Middle East Peace Now.